I studied organic stuff for about 20 years or so ago, and sort of from that rolled into gardening and design and build. Did that for many years, and sort of using those principles of organic method, and so sort of trying to be quite sustainable in the way we built, and more so as we went along. And we're quite successful really with using use of hard materials and reuse of stuff on site, and reclaimed materials, etc. And even something like the soft landscaping, where we quite often just take off the stuff and put it back again to change the shape of the garden, things like that. But it was really when I got to sort of having to specify in soft landscape, like flowers, plants, this sort of stuff, that having read around the subject of extinction crisis and actually industry things and what were some things that were happening in the industry, I realised it wasn't really fit for purpose, and so I just sort of took some time out, wrote for myself a way of working, researched enough to try and sort of get to a point where I was happy with integrity to work again and to revise and specify. That sort of ended up in an online course that I wrote. But going on from that, there's sort of some bits about paper that are in that.
One. You hear that?
You don't want to hear that. Like a stop. Like that. Okay, fine. So, today I just want to go the headlines that came out of that, if you like, or 5 easy things that you could remember that came out of it. I'm going to sort of chat a little bit about today. So, number one would be use native plants or plants that behave like native plants. Actually, I want to go back a little bit. I want to say, why do we want to use our garden? God, I want to go back even further. I want to say, who has a garden? Who is trying in any way to rewild it? There's quite a lot. We can say at least half successfully, unsuccessfully, challengingly. Yeah, so it's always a bit like this, right? It's a bit like, yeah, and I really want to find out what the challenges are. I want to talk just the little things that I found out to start with, and then I really want to come back and just talk about that stuff, if that's okay. I can hear it really well, you can hear it over there. Okay, I'll get a bit better. So one, I would say, why our garden? So I was talking to Martin down here just a minute ago, and it was awesome. How many gardens are there in Britain? So there's 87% of households have gardens, which is 23 million gardens that take up about somewhere in the region of 1.5% of the British landmass. And bearing in mind that we were talking to Sarah King from Rewilding Britain was talking to us yesterday, and I think they support rewilding projects that cover 1% of the British landmass, and farming covers 70% of the British landmass. You can start to put it in a bit of context. So for me, I'm an advocate of gardens and a real fighter for using those spaces to link other spaces. They are different to rewilding a landscape, and we need sort of in a way to talk about them a bit differently. So rewilding is the balancing of bringing species into rebalance the landscape, and I think we can do that in our gardens. And so number one would be using native plants. So all plants that behave like native plants. I actually don't particularly like the word native plants. I tend to use British wild plants because there are actually quite the definition of a native plant is that a plant that has survived since the last ice age, which ended supposedly about 11,500 years ago, or has been introduced but without the use of human help. And so that's okay, and that's fine for sort of botanists and whatever, but it's a little bit restricting when we're talking about what actually we want the function of a plant in the garden to actually do and be. So, in my mind, the definition of a useful British wild plant is that it sits within a balanced place in the ecosystem with its entourage of insects and other creatures that work with it. So a lot of plants in gardens are introduced species. They've got some sort of slightly technical names that I didn't know anything about, even though I've worked in horticulture for many, many, many years, and I'm researching them. So words like archaeophyte and neophyte, and I thought, well, what, they're long words. Are they really useful? But actually, they are incredibly useful. And once you start sort of understanding what those things are, you start really thinking about them in these terms. So an archaeophyte is a plant that has been here for a very long time, for at least 1,500 years. And a neophyte is a plant that has arrived fairly recently, sort of within the last 500 years. And the reason that is because when Columbus discovered the New World in 1492, basically there was something called the Columbian Exchange happened. There was just so much of the traffic. It's almost the start of globalization in a sense. And so there's so much traffic of creatures and wildlife. And it was mainly for anything that came before. The archaeophytes, the very old plants of the year, would have been bought by the first farmers that came over. And they would have sort of originally come from the Fertile Crescent and eventually Rich Britain, and 6,000 years ago here. And they brought kind of medicinal and food plants and making plants and that sort of stuff. And then these much newer plants in the last 500 years have been really kind of more ornamental plants and actually quite sort of show-offy plants, really. You get into plant homes and all that sort of stuff. And those ones have come from a lot further afield often. So a lot of the plants in our gardens that are ornamental have come from a very long way and don't necessarily fit into our plant communities and don't offer the same benefits as those plants that are British wild plants. Now, we know a lot about pollinators as gardeners, and a lot of media and the press and wildlife gardening has been supporting pollinators. Now, a lot of those and there's a bit of a kind of like juxtaposition between the sort of native and the ornamental argument, if you like, around gardeners. But actually, it's not really an argument. It doesn't really have to be a debate. It's fairly simple in respect that because what it doesn't involve is the different stages that insects go through and what they need. So when we're talking about pollinating plants, we're looking at adult insects generally that feed on the nectar or pollen of that plant. Bees have had a really great PR agent over the last little while, and they're doing very well, thank you very much. But actually, anything that produces nectar and pollen is pretty much edible. So it's just sugary water. It just feeds the adult insects who go on and reproduce. And so it's very accessible, and they're called generalist species. Now, there's another whole stage to this, where there's any metamorphosing insects, so flies, beetles, wasps. I look particularly at butterflies and moths, larger moths, because actually when I'm trying to communicate this, actually they're the ones that are most easy to speak of. So let's take the caterpillar, for instance. Now, a caterpillar by moth or butterfly almost certainly will have a very specialist diet. That's because there's this whole chemical warfare that's going on between them, that they've evolved together for thousands of years, and they've grown the right enzymes or whatever to fight the chemicals. So they have a very small amount of plants that they can eat, and they're the plants that they've evolved in. And that is generally a native plant, but it could be, a plant that's been here long. It could even be a neophyte, but that neophyte is brought its insects with it, right? And it might just be so another reason native could be an issue, because actually with global warming, it could just be a range extension of that native plant, as opposed to necessarily being invasive, non-useful species. So, as Sean tells me always, I get down rabbit holes and talk too much about a subject and move away. So I'm going to move on to the next one. So native plants, because of the larval food plant aspect of them. And if anyone can help me make that sound sexier, please do, because it's very dry. So next I would say pesticides used buying and the purchasing of plants, and making sure that they don't use pesticides. I buy plants that don't use peat either, but that's really because of a habitat destruction somewhere else. But actually, pesticides are they're obviously killing. Well, they're not obviously. So most pesticides are systemic, and what that means is that goes into the cells of the plant and throughout all parts of the plant. And so insects, whether they're root feeding or whether they're eating the plant or the leaf or the flower, or taking pollen or nectar or anything from it, once they ingest that, it's often fatally harmful. And even plants that are sold, as in a bit of a hero of mine, Dave Goulson, in his book, The Garden Jungle, Gardening Sacred Planet, talks about, he's a head of biology at Sussex University. Yeah, and so he did an experiment sort of fairly famously of back in 2018, and they took a bunch of plants from fairly locally, but from brands that were all over Britain, and they checked these plants for pesticide use that were labelled for. The famous one, if you like, or the most outrageous one is, and I don't want to down people, but I just want to say you've got to be careful, is RHS had a label that was perfect for pollinators, and they tested all these plants, and they were absolutely saturated in pesticides, and of course the systemic pesticides are killing them that touches it. And again, RHS still haven't actually really addressed this, so they changed that to avoid litigation to plants for pollinators, but there's still no actual evidence that the supply chain has changed. So you have to be very careful. So really only those nurseries that are that say they don't use pesticides, don't have to be organic, but they have to not use pesticides, systemic pesticides, soapy pesticides. There are exceptions, but question, go and ask in your nurseries to say, do you use pesticides, and walk away, and people will change their practices. 3, grow grass longer. Not all of it necessarily, but some of it. So out here, so there's a study done by Butterfly Conservation a couple of years ago, and they covered 6,000 gardens, and they were assessing leaving grass longer, and discovered that up to 93% more butterflies there were 93% more butterflies, and a wider range of butterfly species by leaving longer grass. And so even out here with these coarse grasses, so for instance something like the Coxfoot grass out there supports 7 different species of butterfly. It's the primary larval food plant for 7 species of butterfly. And this is a grass that won't be included in any meadow mixes, or we're continually trying to improve, often in gardens where everyone wants to get lots of MG4 perfect. We're all told that 97% of species-rich wildflower meadows have gone, so we try and put them in our gardens, but then we destroy a whole load of species and habitat to try and do that incredibly invasively using it. So but actually there's great value in these horse grasses that aren't in any of those mixes. And also if you look at the life cycle of those larvae, they, either in their egg stage or caterpillar stage, have a year-long cycle. So that can be okay if you're sort of grazing and not cutting too short, potentially siding. You have to have those tussocks. They live in those tussocks. So when we're cutting down those tussocks to a sort of flat lawn, you're losing all of those species. So you're trying to improve the garden and improve the species diversity and amount, and I completely celebrate that, but I feel that we're doing that in a bit of a, maybe doing more harm than good if we're not really understanding what we're doing. And that brings me to view your garden as a woodland play. So we can kind of get around that a little bit, but rather than trying to introduce all those species into a sort of lawn, meadow sort of situation, we can sort of look at how the vegetation formed in the first place. So you've got things like called vegetative succession. So if you've got primary succession, which is say after an ice age, where it can absolutely scrape clean of all vegetation, and it grows up from lichen, mosses, etc., to annual grasses, up to a climax canopy of forest trees. And then you have a secondary succession, which is an event like a flood or a fire or something like that, which you've still got the soil base and seed base, but you're taking away the vegetation. So you could argue that something like plan is secondary succession. So if we look at our gardens, I find quite a good way to explain people sort of when you start talking about how do I rewild my garden. So there's the sort of things where it's like, yeah, okay, but I don't know what does that look like. With my own garden, I built it with that in mind. So I'm trying to envision. I have a very small amount of lawn in my garden, a little darling beautiful daughter, which I just had to create for her. But the rest of it is really very long, and then but there's these, I think they probably just call it ecotones, where one habitat drifts into another habitat. So the long grass might grow into the hedgerow, and that way you can support your wildflowers in there, and then you can support your shrubs. And then I let a lot of saplings grow in my garden. I don't necessarily let them go to full maturity, but I might sort of copy some, leave some. And this creates this not only a varied species and varied topography, and really sort of interesting for excellent for insects, what I'm really gardening for insects, but excellent topography for birds, etc. to come in, and also for small mammals and sort of reptiles, amphibians, that sort of thing. Finally, come on, five, yeah, lawns. So almost certainly we will want a lawn. Like, they're utilitarian, they work very well for leisure spaces, etc., etc., etc. But what I said about don't use chemicals on them, and don't try not to advise them too short within an inch of their life. But you can introduce a really massively mixed sward of plants, such as we've got massive or self-here, or daisy, or black medic. You'll know all those plants. If you look at any kind of old, sort of established lawn that hasn't been treated, it'll be full of amazing clovers, etc., etc. And yes, of course, you can let that grow a little bit longer as well. And we have No Rain May, and I think they have Let It Grow June now as well. So I say not just May, but yeah. So let all those areas develop together. Oh, 5 minutes! Oh my God! Oh, I didn't get any time. Do I get questions? 5 minutes. Okay, yeah, great. And then sort of more specifically, so how I work now is by looking at those. I've taken those. I'll go into the garden and assess the garden for all of the species, and then I will do an ecological report on each plant. And so I'll assess it for every larval plant that it is host to, and every pollinator, and then we can get a picture of the garden in terms of sort of what it's contributing to, what each plant is contributing. And then we might work with garden design professionals, for instance. They might say, well, go and do your garden design, then bring it back, and we'll assess that design. And then we can potentially look at these plants and say, well, okay, so this one flowers in June, it's yellow, it's a herbaceous perennial. Well, how about we swap that out for this one, which actually really gives us a great deal back. It's not quite as ornamental as that, but it's pretty good. And that's where we can start sort of making some inroads. I'm not completely against ornamental, I'm just saying ornamentals are often what they say they are in terms of being ornamental. I have a little analogy, maybe I can squeeze this in quickly, which is that if we were building a house, we would do the foundations, we build the walls, and put the roofs up before we decorated them. And that's what I'm talking about with the native plants, or plants that act like native plants, that we can put in the base, the really healthy working base for our ecology, and then sort of decorate it afterwards, if you like, with any plants, as long as they're not bringing harm, so after the pesticides, they're just actually bringing joy to you, and whatever that might be. I'd better finish there. The questions, if I've got time for
You've got.
I'm not into time for questions.
You've got 2.5 minutes. So maybe
right.
like 1 or 2 quick questions. We've got a bit of time. We need to like rearrange the room. So.
Yeah.
Can you tell us like the top 5 plants that every gardener in Somerset should have?
Oh yeah. Okay. Top 5 plants that every garden should have. I could do one for now, right now, from a report from Butterfly Conservation, Big Butterfly Count from 2024. I need to consult my paper. I've just designed a little planting scheme. So that showed us which butterflies were in decline from 2023 to 2024. And so what we've done is we've taken instead of, so for instance, I would love to say nettle or something like that. Right? The nettle is an incredible plant. It supports 4 different butterflies. It's primary food plants of 4 different butterflies, but it, I can't go to a garden designer, or most gardeners will say plant nettle. Right? So I'm going to look for another plant. Another plant that might work for you is hop. So a secondary food plant for most of those 4 butterflies is hop. So, but hop can be used in the garden. It's a really excellent garden plant. It's pretty, can get pretty big, but really beautiful, really aesthetic. Because this is part of the issue, right? We have to make these gardens look beautiful. And so what I did was I took the the butterflies most in decline and took those secondary food plants. And anyone can come and find me in a bit, and I can sort of tell them, go through a whole list. I've got a whole list of, I've literally got 50 of the best performing or larval food plants that support more than 20 larvae. So, I mean, let's see. Off the top of my head, birches support about 160 different larvae, I think. Willows support something in the same sort of region. But a little, I'm going to read them right out. So the garlic mustard would be, doesn't seem like a particularly good garden plant. Actually, it's really, really ornamental plant. In the right sort of, it's got a really great colour. And that supports the green veined white, which was down 65% last year. So nasturtium, tufted hair grass. What would you know? I was just going to complete animal. You get hops, red currant, I say goat willow, weld, burstfoot trefoil, that supports 7 different larval food plants. Buckthorn obviously supports brimstone butterfly, and artichoke supports painted lady, which was down 66%. So what I do is I take sort of the data, and then oh my god, I take the data and then I find plants that support it.